New York is a really cool city, but what a lot of people don't understand is even going back to the days of the Dutch colony, there was a lot of types of people already living here. Just because it was a Dutch colony doesn't mean it was exclusively Dutch. There were Swedes who lived here. There were French Protestants who lived here, English, Irish, Welsh. There were Germans who lived here. There were freed and enslaved Africans who lived here. And there were Jews who lived here. There were Sephardic Jews who lived here. In fact, along the East Coast, there was a synagogue in Newport, Rhode Island, New York City, Charlotte, North Carolina, Virginia, and pretty much anywhere there was a synagogue, there was also a slave trade, a kosher meat market, or a kosher meat plant, and also distilleries. You know, a lot of what we're not told in our history books is that Sephardic Jews played a big role in the slave trade, in the transatlantic slave trade in North America. The Dutch West Indies Company was actually set up by a Sephardic Jew who was exiled from Spain called Aaron Lopez. And they were very key in the slave trade, especially in New York and, Rhode Island, Virginia, the 13 colonies. This is how they made their money. Now, if you watch a movie like Amistad, which was a very good movie, it was based on true events. They will show a lot of idolatry, Christian idolatry, crucifixes and Bibles and things like that. But when in actuality, Jewish people were more dominant in the slave trade at that time, and Christianity was opposed to slavery. True Christians would be opposed to slavery. And that's why that's why maybe some of them had Jews do it, just like banking. They had Jews do their dirty work for them because technically it was against their morals. It was a sin. But initially, the governor of New York, Peter Stuyvesant, didn't want to let Jews in. He thought that they couldn't assimilate and that they would ruin the culture and the fabric of our society. And, some people would agree with him to an extent, that's what happens when you allow them too much power in Western nations. And, they were key players in the transatlantic slave trade, and they also became very wealthy with their liquor distilleries because they saw that the Native Americans were predisposed to the disease of alcoholism. So they got them turned on and tanked up, with that firewater. So firewater, slavery, and meat, that they sold to their own people. They also exported it to the Caribbean, where they had Jews living in colonies. And I'm not saying they solely were responsible for the slave trade, but they played a big role. 120 out of 124 slave ships were Jewish-owned. And even though a small minority of people owned slaves, out of the Jews who were here, say maybe 40% of Jewish households own slaves, whereas opposed to maybe 5% of non-Jewish, Christian people own slaves, so it was less than half, but still, Jews were more likely to own slaves than non-Jews. They've always been a minority, so, that small percentage of Jews who were powerful and influential, almost half of them owned slaves. With the whites, it wasn't the case, And a lot of people came here, under different premises. Like a lot of Germans came here, a lot of Hessians as soldiers. A lot of French Protestants were here. Brooklyn's original 5 towns. One of the original 5 towns was Flatlands. Flatlands was a Huguenot town. It was a French Protestant town. And Gravesend is an English town, named after Gravesend. That's just 30 miles outside of London. New Utrecht was also a British town, but we have towns like Coney Island, which wasn't part of Brooklyn, but it eventually became annexed into Brooklyn in like 1898 when Brooklyn became part of the city of New York. Bushwick, which was it encompassed was now Bushwick, Williamsburg, and Greenpoint. That was a neighborhood that was a Dutch neighborhood. Yeah, and a lot of people don't know that about history. That the original colonists. Yeah, we had Swedes, we had Danish people, we had Belgians, we had Germans, Irish, English, Welsh, Scottish, and a lot of these people were also indentured servants. Initially, when this country opened up, the blacks and the whites were indentured servants. This is before a system of slavery and before a system of racial divide and white supremacy was invented. So, for the first 15, 20, 30 years, whatever it was, that's how they operated, and there were free blacks, by the 17th century, there were a good handful of free blacks, and some of them were prosperous. There were black communities in Brooklyn, black farming communities, and in Manhattan there was one. There was a community in what became Central Park that was the first affluent black community that they eventually demolished to make way for the park, but it was one of the first affluent black communities, and most of the people there who were homeowners and shop owners, they were born into slavery, and they managed to pull themselves up and do well for themselves, But a lot of people don't know that. A lot of people don't know that 96 islands surround New York City. That there's 96 islands in New York City, and that some of them are habitable. And some people live on some of those islands, like Broad Channel and City Island and Roosevelt Island. But there's also, and Governor's Island. But there's also islands that people squatted on back in the days that people don't know about. Like. My grandfather used to go to some of those islands in Jamaica Bay and visit with his distant relatives, and they would fry up eels and stuff, and they were squatters. They built a shack in Jamaica Bay on one of those islands, and that's what people did back then, My grandfather was born in 1920. During the Depression, that's how people lived, He also had an uncle who was a bootlegger during the Depression, and that's how he made his money, And it's a lot of people have a lot of misnomers about history. They like to rewrite history. When New York was first started, the first people, the first Europeans who came, they stayed on Governor's Island. They were terrified to go to Manhattan or to go to Long Island, where what's Brooklyn and Queens is part of Long Island. They didn't go to Staten Island. Yeah, they were afraid. They stayed on this little island until it was cool, and then they went to Manhattan. They bought Manhattan off the Indians, blah, blah, blah. And they started building up between, the little park down there and then Wall Street. And then eventually they started building and building and building more and more. And Brooklyn was basically just Brooklyn Heights, and it was just farmland back then. Brooklyn was largely farmland until, there was a lot of farms going up until World War II even. My grandpa would tell me he would take the trolley out this way where I'm from, and there was shit here. There was nothing. There was just lots. Until World War One, they started doing some building. World War II, they did more building. They built like suburbs and low-rise apartments. And here in Coney Island, high-rise apartments and whatnot.